Hey everyone, wherever you are, I hope you're having a wonderful week so far. We're here with the latest episode of the Inside Crypto Show, interviews and discussions with regular people just like yourselves. Today we're joined by Max Howell, the CEO of tea.xyz and creator of Homebrew. Brew is one of the largest open source projects of all time with tens of million users to this day. That's a lot, but we've got lots more to talk about. Max is so much more beyond than just Brew. Um, if you're old like me, you would remember it, but if you're new, we'll talk about that as well. Max, thank you so much for making time. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Thank you. Sure. So I started programming when I was six, which was fortunate. It was going to be such a big deal. I guess my dad had an idea and just sat me down in front of the computer we had at the time, which was this UK machine called a BBC Micro that was somehow branded with the British Broadcasting Corporation. And it booted straight into a programming prompt. There wasn't a huge amount of other things to do with it. So I just started making games and things. But I never really considered it as a career option, partly because it wasn't a revered career path at the time. I was born in 81, so during the 90s, I was trying to figure out what to do with myself. So I ended up going to university and doing a science degree in chemistry and went into the industry. And after about 3 months, I realized that I'd made a terrible mistake. And the truth was that everyone who told me that chemistry was boring was right. And I fell into this like depressed funk where I just didn't know what I was doing with my life. I always thought that this path I was taking was the correct one. And I installed Linux on my home PC and started exploring the world of open source. And I found all these different communities in the Linux world that were trying to make computing better. Like, just in general, there was this strong belief system of what we were doing in open source was the way software should be developed. And the way that everybody like just grabbed onto their little pieces and then maintained their little pieces and made it so that you could build like these enormously more capable systems based on like just these tiny pieces that little people were maintaining here and there. I loved it and started building out these apps and things with a bunch of other people. And honestly, it's my favorite period of programming I ever had, where I just would stay up all night programming with a bunch of other people around the world that I barely knew. I didn't know who they were. I didn't know anything about them really, apart from the fact that we all were compelled to build this set of software together. And I was living with my parents at the time, and they were gradually getting more and more frustrated with the fact that I didn't seem to be taking my life seriously. To them, it seemed like I was wasting it, right? And they wanted me to go off and become a lawyer or a doctor or something. And I was just hacking with a bunch of geeks during the night, barely coming up during the day. So they kicked me out of the house. And that made me look for work. So I found this company in London that was willing to hire me just simply based on the open source I'd made, because they used some of it. It was Last Fem in London, and so I got myself into the industry just by working in open source. And so I always feel that the story isn't unique. People don't realize that you can just prove yourself with open source contribution, but I think it's harder nowadays for sure. This was 2004-ish, so the industry still was yet to prove itself. The internet was becoming very important, but still, you talk with your parents and they'd be like, I don't really see why we need it particularly. And Web 2 was just becoming like a word and a thing that people were trying to build out something that was better than what the web was at the time. So yeah, I worked there for a few years, but stuck with the open source on the side quite a lot. And it was while I was there that I created Homebrew, and I did that because we needed it. Like, we needed something like it. We were doing a lot of work on Mac, and Mac was becoming the platform of choice for devs, partly because it's Unix underneath, but with a nicer UI on top of it. Like, even nowadays, Linux is still a mess, honestly. Like, I every now and again check it out because I'm like, I don't really want to be this Apple fanboy. I want to get back to my open source roots, and I try and use it, and it's just like one of my long-term goals is honestly to build a better Linux desktop environment. I would love to do that, getting there one step at a time. So yeah, built out Homebrew, and then for a few months nobody noticed it, and then a few things happened, and it gained huge amounts of traction really quickly, and just became this enormous piece of open source that impacted everything I've done since.
And I wish we could spend more time talking about this, but I wish this was a programming tech podcast. Unfortunately, it is not. Max, so tell us about like when you came to the realization of tea.xyz and integrating your very diverse background with Linux and Unix and things that you've done, open source programming with, I hate using Web3, but whatever you want to call it, integrating all of that together to make tea.xyz.
Yeah, so, my career after Homebrew was kind of like zipped around between different startups and tried as much as possible to work on open source because honestly, it's still what I love the most. I try to find startups that were as exciting as working on open source, but just nothing ever filled the itch of building something and then having this community build around it, and then you're creating something new that allows people to build new things entirely, like stuff you couldn't even imagine, and nothing quite scratched the itch like working on package management type stuff, because you take the millions and millions of open source packages, and if you present them in the right way, it allows people to build things you never even imagined possible, right? There's no way we'd have all this new AI tech and all the new blockchain type tech if it wasn't for the open source foundation that like holds all that up and makes tooling available that can then build out those parts. And that's just incredibly invigorating. So I found a few jobs here and there. Like I taught iPhone development for a few years, half time, so that I could spend the other half of the time working on open source. And in that time, I built out a few packages that still are really large as well, although obviously nothing as big as Homebrew. And then I was working on Homebrew for years. I say that at the beginning, when I was working on it, I had 2 full-time jobs because I'd have to like work on something that paid the bills, and then in my evenings and weekends, I didn't go out and I didn't have a girlfriend or anything. I just worked on Homebrew, and it was difficult, but I was young, so you didn't need as much sleep, and you could find the energy for it. But the truth is, Homebrew almost certainly was slower to become the mature piece of software that it was because I didn't have the time to work on it all the time. And it's just a common problem with open source. Everyone's aware of it, that open source is this public good, and yet the people that are maintaining it don't even like really qualify for charitable donation, and sponsorship is like severely lacking. Like people have tried to solve it with sponsorship and bounties and solutions like that, but it just never worked. There was a time where I spent about 6 months trying to raise my profile on Patreon and other sponsorship mechanisms to try and get it so that I had like enough money to pay rent and health insurance and all the other things that you need to pay for. And it was a very tedious 6 months of trying to get people to buy in. Like, it would be different if Homebrew was new at the time, but it wasn't. It was established. So people were like, I love Homebrew, but I don't see why I'm sponsoring this. It's already fine. Like, this general attitude. And developers feel bad about this attitude, but it doesn't change anything. Like, I wanted to figure out a way for myself or others to be able to work on open source full time, but it just wasn't there. And it was a couple of years ago where I started looking back into Web3 and blockchain technologies. And I know you say you don't like to refer to it like that, but calling it that was clever. Like, I don't know who came up with it because it made people like me have another look. Okay, it's not just a cryptocurrency. There's something else to it, right? There's something we're trying. It's a very gutsy statement to call it Web3, and I think a lot of Web2 types feel that. What's it done that earned this rebranding, this relabeling of it? Like, you're adding a whole one to the web. Like, that's a pretty gutsy statement. But when I looked into it a bit more carefully, I realized that there was a lot of very interesting technology there that I skipped. I hadn't really paid attention to the ascent of it. And so I started diving into the smart contracts and what you could do with them and what people were doing with this tech. And it was just one evening I had this like moment of clarity, a moment of inspiration where I understood that you could build a system that understood the package graph of open source using package managers as that data source. And with smart contracts, you could make it so that there was a model which distributed token accordingly to the importance of the open source, and thus potentially fix the problem that open source has, where it's just so vastly important. Like nowadays especially, I think it caught most of us who were working in open source when it was newer by surprise. Like, we knew it was possible that it could power the world, And then over the last 15 years, it really has gotten to the point where it absolutely does. It's the stack that everything is built on top of. And a lot of people don't realize it, right? Because there's just like this thin proprietary layer that they interact with. Like every website's closed source slither on top of this enormous stack of software that is maintained as a public good, essentially. So yeah, I then pursued investment for it, and it was surprisingly easy to get people on board. Like I'd just be like, hey, I create Homebrew, tens of millions of users, and I think we can do a Web3 version of that. They were like, here's the money. So it's been about 2 years, and we're very far along at this point.
Nice. That's exciting as well. Like anyone who's watched this podcast or the other one that I do in my own time, right? Content creators are familiar with OBS, right? Open Broadcasting System, which is another famous open source project. And even like people like you born in 81, right? I was born in 82, and you would have seen from the 80s to the 90s different like forms of projects. And like people never think like these guys that are doing it like yourself in your free time, right? What are they earning? Is it livable, right? And now in the day of Patreon and Kickstarter, and it's still, like you just mentioned, your experience, right? It's still not enough for people. Okay, you've created Tea, right? Is the next step then to say, go out to open source projects and say, hey, you should use our system? Or is it more of a passive thing? Are you waiting for them to say, hey, oh, I found this Tea thing. I think this actually might be worth it for this project, whatever project it is. I should talk to Max Howell and the team at tea.xyz to onboard with them.
Yeah, we would love if open source projects would come to us. We're not yet live, so we're in the sort of outreach process. We're actually actively doing that right now, where like we've identified a bunch. Like we've built what's going to be an oracle on the chain, which assesses the rankings of all open source projects. We'll be launching with 5.5 million open source projects ranked. Wow. But we think there's more like 25 to 30 million projects. Each package manager, we use its registry to calculate this, what we're calling T rank. And the ranking system is based on the idea that open source projects choose their dependencies, and that choice is like a reputational score, essentially. And if we know the reputations of the packages at the outer edges, and the outer edges is usually what gets sponsorship, right? And still, though, the sponsorship these projects get is usually abysmal, and that's why over the last 5 or 6 years, a lot of commercial open source companies have formed where they're like, hey, we're building this open source, but we know it has value, and we can see that value because enterprise shops adopt us like crazy. So how about you fire some traditional VC funding, and we try and make a services structure on top of that? And I understand why people are doing that, but I don't personally like it at all. Because I think that it puts too much of an agenda into the open source. And open source is wonderful because it is agenda-free. Or at least the only agenda is that of the creators and maintainers who know what they're trying to solve. They're only trying to solve the problem. The problem is all that matters. As soon as you make it into a commercial type setting, then the agenda of the board and the investors and your customers becomes way more important. And I think you see that time and again, actually, in commercial open source, where as soon as they get big enough, someone makes a new version of the project. And open source has always been very good at this. If you see the project won't accept your pull request, or it's going to be too difficult to get your pull request in there, and you need this feature, eventually you start coming up with the project that should replace it. So fortunately, that happens. But one of the things I love about T Protocol is that we don't change the incentives for those people who are trying to solve these problems. Instead, we are actually fixing some of the other incentives, like the fact that often security is an afterthought in open source, which it's terrifying, frankly, that we have this huge body of software and it's full of security holes. For years, people would say, security through obscurity isn't a thing, so closed source isn't any better than open source. But I think that we've seen that actually the people who are incentivized to find these security holes are not the good guys. They can make a lot more money by finding a hole and then selling it to people who are interested in exploiting that or exploiting it on their own. So, and like the incentives just aren't aligned for open source projects to care about security sufficiently. Like they care about their own needs, and if they think it's secure enough, then they're not going to do an audit. I think Web3 is different in that respect because it's just so devastating if someone does find a hole in a smart contract, as we've seen time and again, right? But in the base of open source that powers all of that stuff on top, security is often an afterthought. So I love that we're not changing the incentives for why open source is built, but also changing the incentives for the problems with open source for everybody. And we genuinely think that everyone's going to take note of that aspect of it once we get going. But anyway, back to your question, which was like how we're doing the outreach. ITN is planned for the first quarter of next year. And so we're currently trying to find the right kinds of projects to onboard and reaching out. I'm reaching out personally and trying to. There's certain projects that we're just not going to get on board initially, but if we get the right projects initially, then they will evangelize and influence their networks, and then it will spread. And we've built incentives into how the protocol works so that you, as a project that's onboarded, are encouraged to reach out to your dependencies because that will increase your token rewards. So you start off with a reasonable amount of token reward every epoch. But if you manage to get all your dependencies onboarded, then we increase that by a certain percentage. And that goes down all the way. We mapped out these projects so they go super deep. It's crazy how deep a project's dependency list can be. Like a typical React project has thousands of dependencies. It's insane. And if you think about the liability you have as someone shipping that software and not knowing for sure that it's all like actually secure, or even that it won't have like bugs that are problematic. One of the consequences of being on our protocol is that you are expected to care more about that kind of stuff. And I hate to say it, but open source maintainers typically don't. They don't. Like I have personally, but a lot of them don't. And I love that we're not going to be forcing anyone to care, right? But it's just if you actually get value out of the system that we're building, then you'll want to care. We're just changing those incentives. There's no handcuffed forcing of anyone to care more about these aspects of their software.
Okay. Max, so I'm a dev. I'm listening to this on Apple Podcasts or I'm watching the video on YouTube later. And I'm like, okay, cool. This sounds interesting. Tea is not live just yet, but it is going to be live next year at some point, right? And it's okay, sweet. I'm going to quit my 9 to 5 and this is going to be my thing. I'm going to work on open source and Tea is going to be the way I survive. Is that possible? Was that suggested? Is it going to be good enough to just be on Tea and have some sort of a living?
Obviously, we hope that the open source that onboards is rewarded to the extent that it can change how they live. It's in many ways the goal, right? That we change the nature of open source so that these people that are working currently, let's face it, like being a dev can be quite lucrative, and you aim for a FANG company or something so you can get your like 200,000 a year plus. No, it would be great if some of these people who are incredibly smart and capable were funneling their genius towards things that actually benefited the entire software industry and us in many ways, like the humanity as a whole. It appalls me that we got so many engineers working at Facebook and shit like that, and they spend all their time just creating more engagement bait algorithms, essentially, and like a lot of the things we built with Web 2 turned out to be pretty toxic, honestly, and we got all these people that are engaged full-time in increasing that toxicity. They should be funneling their intelligence towards something that is actually beneficial for everyone. I really hope that it can be like that, but we don't know how long it's going to take for the value to be correctly attributed to all the projects that matter. And so the best thing anyone can do really is onboard during the ITN so we can figure out how well it's going to work. And the onboarding process is going to be super fun, honestly. Like, you'll be able to see as soon as you're onboarded exactly how much of the token is going to be rewarded to you and distributed, and how that funnels throughout the whole of your dependency graph. So I really hope that it's going to be a fun one-click for a lot of devs. Like, even if they're skeptical about Web3 tech, which, you know, let's face it, the last bull market really destroyed the reputation of this industry for a lot of people in general, not just devs. But I get a lot of abusive responses on Twitter about it, and like people just very stubborn in their beliefs. But we really hope that our project will be one of those projects that changes mindsets. There isn't going to be a rug pull, and that the distribution of token is fair at launch, And our goals genuinely are altruistic with this. There isn't like some portion of token rewards that's funneling to the company or anything like that. All of the system is built to sustain the entire open source ecosystem. As a company, we're going to have to figure out our own revenue models after this thing goes live. Like, we have ideas, but we aren't directly like taking a piece of it. So I think people will see that, but yeah, we just have to wait for how the next 6 months go, basically.
So you mentioned ideas, but what are your ideas for potential revenue streams? Again, this is far in the future, so they're just ideas. I want to emphasize that to anybody who's watching or listening. Nothing's concrete, right? Yeah, what are your ideas for revenue streams next year?
Next year, probably not, honestly. I think our investors are aware of the fact that in an open AI kind of way, that we're trying to do this for the good of the open source ecosystem. So revenue models are on the back burner while we build out the protocol and make sure it works. I think I don't want to describe anything specifically. In a way, it's proprietary IP, the ideas we have, and I don't want other people to build them in advance for us because I've spoiled it on this podcast. But I think anyone who has any experience with what you can do with Web3 probably has some ideas about how we intend to use our expertise in the protocol that we're building in order to try and build additional things on top of that can have value to open source and commercial entities that use open source. Most of our revenue models are along the lines of that. Like, we have built this useful utility layer, and people can build successful businesses on top of that, just using the fact that we've created a way to attribute value to open source, which has so much value. Everybody knows how valuable open source is. It's just nobody's figured out how to actually use that understanding in a way that it functions. Like I was saying before, like bounties and sponsorship just don't cut it. If anything, they still consider open source to be a charity in that respect. And it's not a charity, it's like fundamental infrastructure that is keeping the whole world running, and it needs to be treated as such, but in a way that doesn't really change it, change how it's built and how it works. It was a vital piece of how we designed it out, like the whole time. It's not it's just not going to work if we change it for a start. If we change open source into something else, then people will just start creating open source in a traditional sense again. You can't change the incentives that have already driven all this production of free software, essentially. Yeah.
No, and I think while you were describing this earlier, I was thinking of the great example of Amazon saying, okay, we're not using Android anymore. Android was the really famous open source operating system, and people are like, why not? And then people realized, hey, yeah, Android is free, but Google has a whole list of caveats. If you use Android, you can't do this and this, and this goes back to what you said about commercial open source, and this is why Amazon's made their move to go to Fire OS and remove some of those limitations.
Yeah, open source tends to correct itself. It can take some time. And you can see how far money can take open source. Android's a great example, right? Google have huge coffers, so they could afford to turn Linux into this extra step beyond what the open source community was capable of in the timescales that Google did it. So you can see how what we're doing can take the power away from these Web 2 companies that took all this open source software and then showed what it was capable of, but then didn't really contribute back or care to in many ways. Google do sponsor a lot of open source, or they hire open source people, but I don't like when they hire these. As I was saying before, it absolutely introduces agenda and direction that isn't necessarily in the best interests of the open source community and the world of software that we build on top of that. And that's part of the reason that I'm passionate about what we're doing, is fixing that. It seems very important.
And I totally agree with you. There are so many things that are just rumbling around in my mind about open source, and especially coming from South Africa, and software and education, and Ubuntu Linux is a good example. As a young person, you don't really, okay, I'm poor, I can't do anything, and you get older, finally I can donate to these projects, so these pieces of software that I use for free, and somebody has spent hours or years of their life building, right? But bring this all back to tea. I have some ideas of impacts that you could have in the future, but of course, coming from you is always better. What do you hope in 5 years' time when people talk about Max Howell and it's now no longer talking about Homebrew? What do you want your impact to be with tea?
Yeah, I hope they're not talking about me, honestly. I'm a reluctant celebrity in the fields that I am a celebrity in, which, thank God, is just like devs and not like beyond that. I want that Tea protocol has achieved its purpose and transformed how open source is made sustainable and increased like the security of the huge stack that exists. And it would be wonderful if people suddenly have a choice about how they are sustaining themselves, and that Tea protocol becomes something they can use as Kickstarter for what they're doing. And we hope there's going to be a bunch of DeFi built on top that also is designed to make creating like open source companies as such something you can do without the VC funding, just built on top of the protocol. And I think that's one of the things that's totally unique to Web3 and crypto is these novel ideas for financial instruments. You just need to build the right base layer for these people who have. It's just so open source, the whole thing. Like, you build a nice utility, and then people who have like ideas in a different sort of layer can then see how they can build on top of that. Like, it's one of the most interesting things I found with all of this, because that's my passion about open source has always been. It's like, hey, just go down to the Unix terminal command line. I love the way all the little tools do one little thing, but then you compose them together and you produce something that's just so much more powerful. And that's part of the reason that spreadsheets are so popular, is that they embody that concept, although in a more confined way. Like, I think we use spreadsheets occasionally, but if you start understanding how to use the command line with different scripting languages, then you reach for it less often. And yeah, so I would love for people to build out things that we haven't even thought. The thing I love most about open source is like you build out something that is useful, but you don't fully understand why or what's possible. Like, you haven't thought of all the ideas. You have a few. You're like, oh, well, I could do this. That's cool. And then other people turn up and they blow you away with this thing that you didn't even think of that could be done with what you've built. And it's just deeply satisfying to know that you've enabled entirely new things. And I'm very excited to see what people will build. And I think that the things they will build will most of the time have like direct contribution to making open source sustainable and secure. That's exciting.
That's definitely exciting. We brought up around the same time. I think there's a lot of potential there that's just been so scattered and not really put together in the same place, and I'm looking forward to it. Max, it's been an interesting conversation and so much more, but I think you've covered a lot of the essentials of what you're doing with tea and what the future is going to look like in the next year and the next 2 years. Before we end up today's show, is there anything else about tea that you'd like to tell our listeners or our viewers? Anything that you're supposed to say that you haven't said yet? But I mean, anything, up to you. Floor is yours. Take as much time as you want. How would you like to end up today's podcast?
Yes, if you're a developer, or even if you're not, and you're just passionate about open source and what's possible with it, then check out tea.xyz. That's our website. Nice 3-layer domain. And sign up for the waitlist. That's how you'll find out all the things we have planned over the next 6 to 12 months. And like, firstly, starting with the incentivized testnet, which should be live early Q1 next year. So yeah, we're very close to it. Right, it's important just to keep on top of these things. So the email or the Twitter, and then everyone knows a project that's important to them. And what we're going to need is for those projects to onboard or at least consider it. And some evangelism on behalf of what we're doing is going to help. It's one thing when I go out there and tell everyone how great it is. They're like, of course you think it's great. You're the one building it. These things only work if other people also believe that. And the way that works is you have to tell them about it. So like, I hope that I've inspired the people listening to this to care about what we're doing and believe in it. And I'm not going to ask you to evangelize us if you don't believe it. But if you do, that would really help. Thanks.
I mean, with your reputation, right? Like, even I'm not a dev or a programmer just for fun, right? Like, I know who you are, but like, it should be like easy given your reputation for people to say, oh my God, Max Howell's doing this thing, we've got to join.
Yeah, it certainly helps for
Cool.
sure. It's just a factor in terms of why what we're building is going to work and why it's going to be a success. Is I got the background and I have a great team, and we did identify a problem that's real, and we found a solution that has like really good odds, I'd say, of working. But at the end of the day, if the open source projects don't on board, we're going to have more trouble. And I think it's going to be, as I say, like a viral thing where it will be so easy to onboard, and then you can see, in a way, like we're telling open source projects how important they are. And one of the things I've noticed about open source devs is that's a big motivator. Like they're heavily incentivized by the reputational gain and like feeling smug about what they built. Like I feel it too, right? I've done loads of open source projects that got nowhere, and then the ones that I did that did get somewhere, I love it. It feels good, and we're giving you a rank. Like, hey, your project's like one of the most important ones in the world, but the only way you'll find out is if you sign up. So I think that's going to help for sure, and the fact that it's going to be fun engaging with the protocol. It's not just work. Like we're trying to minimize the amount of work. So yeah, there's always a lot of factors, and we're doing what we can. Obviously, you've got a big marketing push going on now for the next few months, and we're gaining followers on the platforms quite healthily, and it's encouraging. But yeah, we'll see.
Perfect. And I appreciate you taking the time to appear here and talk to people. And especially for me, it's fun having a bit more techie focused podcast as opposed to strictly crypto blockchain focused one. And as usual, if you're watching this episode, right, all the socials for tea.xyz will be down there. There'll be time codes as well, so if you want to go skip it back and forth and just check out things that you might have missed, please do that. And Max, thank you so much for taking time. And I look forward to possibly, if you do have time next year, catching up in a year or so and saying, hey, this is where we've come, this is where we're going for 2025. That would be awesome. And thanks again, and talk to you soon.
Yeah, great. I would love to be back to talk about how it's gone. So yeah, I look forward to that. Thank you.